And hello, everyone. And this is our Patreon seminar on the shadow and shadow work. And, I would love to say that I have spent weeks preparing this, but actually I woke up this morning and realized it's Sunday. And I thought to myself, how am I going to do this? I've spent no time preparing for it, except for 40 years working with it. We'll be fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk to you about what the shadow is and how you work to heal and integrate it. Basically from experience. There's not a lot of other things that I personally feel a need to add. In Correllianism, we're very big on healing and integrating the shadow. It's a very big part of what we do. I think everyone here has been through the vast majority of our lessons. You'll know that it starts in the very first lesson, but we don't call it shadow work, and there's a reason for that. But in our very first lesson in first degree, we have what I believe we call a healing bath. But that bath is shadow work. It is about addressing the shadow and healing and integrating the shadow without ever mentioning it. And we don't mention the shadow, I don't think, until lesson 8 of first degree. And the reason for that is that people find it a scary term. They find it a scary idea. They don't really understand what it is. And so that's really what I need to start with. What does the term shadow in this context mean? The thing about a shadow is the shadow is what is created by the absence of light. In this case, the absence of knowledge or vision. The shadow is the parts of yourself you don't see. The term shadow, I believe, primarily comes out of Jungian astrology, Jungian psychology. But if there were Jungian astrology, it would be there too. And although I believe the term comes from there, the idea, I think, is much older. There are others who would say the term comes from Plato and his famous example of Plato's cavern and the shadows on the wall. But the idea of the shadow is that it is the parts of yourself that you're not conscious of. A lot of places in first degree, we talk about crossing wires when you're doing magic. The difference between what you think you want and what you really want inside. A famous example of this, one that I think we use in first degree, is the idea of the person who wants the ideal job, but in their heart, they don't believe they can have it. That's an example of the shadow interfering in daily life. That blockage is in the shadow. The conscious mind doesn't see it. The conscious mind thinks it wants that job. But the shadow is still there. And it will block those wires. It will stop that process because of the things that are in it. So when we're working with magic, when we're working with spiritual development, we have to address the shadow because so often we trip ourselves up because of what we don't see. The shadow manifests sometimes in very obvious ways, like phobias. I had a lady by the name of Judy, a wonderful person, had a total fear of water, in the sense of swimming, not in the sense of the shower. But she hated to go into a swimming pool or a lake. She had a fear of drowning. Could never figure out why until one day, I believe in her mid-50s, maybe her early 60s, she was watching a special about the sinking of the Lady Elgin, which was a famous shipwreck. And she realized watching it that this was very familiar and very difficult for her to see. And she realized it must be a past life experience. And she worked with that to heal that and subsequently no longer had a fear of drowning. That's the kind of thing that shows up in your shadow. Belief systems that you have acquired in the past also often linger in your shadow. Expectations from your past. I'll give you an example of that. Years ago, and this is one I quote all the time, but I'll do it again because I'm at that point in life where telling the same story over and over is kind of expected of my age. But I had fallen in love with a person that I knew quite well, had a good relationship with, and really wanted to take the relationship to another level. And I was attempting to pursue this, but weird things were stopping it. And one day we were to get together for lunch, and I waited for them, and they never came. And a little later in the day, I called them and said, what happened? And the answer was, well, I was there ringing the doorbell and knocking on the door, and you weren't there. And, for whatever reason, I never heard it. I had no idea they'd ever been at the apartment. Um, so I apologized. We rescheduled, and I called Lady Crystal, who I think everyone here knows was my teacher. And I said to her, this is very troubling. What is going on? And she told me, this has to do with your shadow and the beliefs and expectations in it. And she told me how to deal with it. And we'll come back to this. But what I found in analyzing my feelings and the things in my shadow is that I had some very negative ideas about romantic relationships. What they were based on at the time, if you had asked me, I would have said that they were basically influenced by aspects of my parents' relationship and other relationships I'd seen growing up that didn't strike me as especially positive. From today, I would say it's probably past life related, and probably has gone through more than one. But I did the things that Lady Crystal instructed, and we'll come back to those, to work with this and to try to heal and integrate that part of myself, to heal those limitations and then integrate that energy back. And I found that I was able to move forward in that relationship, which still didn't end up going anywhere because it was not a relationship I had any karmic business having. But the things that were stopping it basically stopped stopping it until it became obvious that it really wasn't the right thing to do. And thereafter, I did not have that kind of problem again. These are the kind of things that you find in your shadow. One of the biggest things that we have in our shadow are self-doubt and self-denigration. You often hear the term tapes playing in the back of your head from your parents or your childhood, to which I would add also past lives. This is part of your shadow. A lot of people carry negative expectations and negative self-image that's not rooted in their present at all, but rooted in their past, often in other people's attitudes, which, having been younger, that they internalize, and sometimes from things in past lives they're not aware of. If you do past life work with people, you'll often find that these things are reflected in this life rather than caused in them, and are often very deep issues. This is why shadow work can take a long time to accomplish. I have found in the 40 odd years I've been doing it, well, maybe closer to 50 odd years at this point, that it's always there. Now I'm long past the point where I had a lot of it that needed doing, but there's always more. And it's still something. Well, as long as you're alive, you add to the shadow. How do you add to the shadow? The shadow is built basically from emotional reactions to things. When I talk about karma, I talk about it as attachment created by emotional reactions. So in a manner of speaking, there is a very strong relationship between the shadow and karma. You might describe it as the karma you're carrying with you. When we talk about shadow work, it's also called karmic disentanglement. It's unraveling all those karmic attachments. We also describe it as energetic blockages. These are all different ways of approaching the same thing, which is the one major goal of almost all metaphysical systems. And that is self-healing and self-improvement, moving yourself forward spiritually and otherwise. As we go through life, anything that creates a negative emotional attachment is going to end up in our shadow. This is one reason why it's good to develop an attitude that does not attach emotionally to things like that. It's good to not allow yourself to be too strongly influenced by other people's opinions and by situations that might cause this kind of blockage. That's not to say don't pay attention to them, but don't be emotionally affected by it. When we have this kind of traumatic experience, sometimes we're aware of it, sometimes we're conscious of it, very often we're not. That's when it's in our shadow, when it's not something we can see. And that's why it's called the shadow. Almost every person has things from their childhood stuck in their shadow. A lot of people have things from their youth stuck in their shadow. Especially their teenage years, when there's so much anxiety in dealing with other people, so much judgment or seeming judgment, particularly self-judgment. And they grow older, and consciously they grow out of this, but it's still there because they haven't really dealt with the emotions they had at the time. This is what shadow work is about. It also carries from one lifetime into the next, and sometimes in very unexpected ways. And I'll give you an example of that. You know, I like to teach through example a lot of times. Once, very long ago, more or less 30 years ago, actually, I had a client who was telling me after her reading, and I feel like I can discuss it because you know nothing about this woman, and it's unlikely, I think unlikely she'd even still be living at this point. But her reading had all been about spiritual development in her immediate future. And it turned out that she had only recently started her spiritual journey. She'd always wanted to, but never been able to. And through past life work, she had found that in a previous life, she had been killed because of her involvement in metaphysics and psychic practices. And when she was reborn into this life, part of her contract was that she could not deal with that until she passed the age of 50, because that was the age in which she died in the previous life. That's a shadow thing. At any point in this life, had she become aware of that and approached it through shadow work, she could have removed that limitation, but it was there. And you'll find sometimes with people, things they've wanted, things they've tried to do could not happen till a certain age because it was part of their contract. But they had no knowledge of this. That is shadow. And these are all things that we approach and work with in shadow work. It's part of why it's so important. I hate to make it sound like shadow work is the answer to everything, but to an awful lot of things, it is the answer. And one of the reasons I decided to do this particular workshop is that this is one of the things I'm most commonly asked about, because it's one of the things I most commonly mention, because it is so often the answer. When we look at the shadow, there are certain things we must be aware of. One of them is that it can be painful. The things that are there because they were painful. They're there because they were difficult to deal with. They're there because we could not let go of them. When we talk about karma through attachment, it's the things we could not let go of. The things that hold us as much as we are holding them, at least in the way that we see it. And of course, the truth is we can let go of it any time. That's what this is all about. But we usually aren't aware that we can do that until we come to a certain point. I often like to reference the example given in A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens of the ghosts with their long chains that they're dragging through the afterlife, which is their shadow. In that case, he was talking particularly about bankers and businessmen whose chains were all about finance and money, but it could be anything. And that really is what we do. We attach these things to us because we cannot emotionally let go of them. And shadow work is the letting go. And until we do that, we carry those chains. We drag those chains with us. A lot of people look at karma as a substitute for the Judeo-Christian idea of reward and punishment. And it's not about that at all. It's about attachment. And if you look at the world, that's kind of obvious. You don't really see karma operating in that reward and punishment sort of way for the most part. All too often, you'll see people who do terrible things and just keep right on going. And one of the reasons is that while that may have gone into their shadow, it also may not have, depending on how they attach to it. And part of the reason for that is that this is a race that we run by one and one. It's about our own development, our own relationship to spirit, and not everyone else. And eventually we all get where we need to be. Sometimes it takes longer, sometimes it's harder. And it's always a long journey. The shadow, I mentioned earlier that when we think of the term shadow, it's the absence of light. And what we're doing is we're bringing light, that is to say, our vision, our knowledge, to these things that are hidden from us, but still attached to us. When we do that, we can see what they are. If you've been through the second degree lessons, you will come across a particular form of shadow healing, which I think also is not necessarily described by that term, wherein you find your own inner wounds within and visualize them in the form of people or things, and then heal them as if they were separate from yourself. That's what we're doing. We're healing these things just as we might heal another person, just as we might heal an illness, just as we might heal anything. And sometimes it's helpful to think of this as being separate from yourself, even though it's not. There are all kinds of ways to do shadow work, but let's talk about a few of them. And I'm going to start with the simple one that I normally recommend, and that's the one that Lady Crystal recommended to me years ago when I was pursuing that long ago romantic interest, who it turned out not to really be the right interest for me, but was a lovely person. But what she recommended I do was this, and this is the simplest form of shadow work that I would recommend beyond this, well, beyond things like the healing bath in first degree. But if you want a truly strong effect, this would be the first place to start. And that is to take the subject that you have identified, in this case it was romantic relationships, and examine how you feel about it. And what she told me to do, and what I still tell people to do, is to take two pieces of paper, and on one of them, write down everything that you can identify that you feel about that subject. Could be romantic relationships, could be financial situations, could be parental situations, anything that is causing you a problem from your shadow. Write down how you feel. Don't analyze it, don't think about it, write it down. And like I say, I found that I had a lot of negative assumptions about romantic relationships. Another way of looking at that I didn't see at that time is I also had some unrealistic expectations of what a good relationship would be, which is typical for the society in which we live. I wrote all that down, and then step two was to wait 24 hours and then go back to it. And in going back to it, go through each and everything and ask myself, is that true? Do I really think that? Or am I holding on to that from previous things? And I found that for the most part, yeah, I didn't really believe that. I felt it. I didn't believe it. I was holding on to it from previous things. And as I went through it, there were still some things on that list that I found to be things I did believe, but they were few. And so many things that were just old tapes playing in my head, to use that phrase again. And so then, and I must point out, this was long ago, before smoke detectors were everywhere. The instruction was to do a burning. And so on yet another piece of paper, um, I wrote down, on that second piece of paper, I wrote down all the ones that I no longer believed, that no longer served me. And part of the thing to recognize in doing this is that at the time you adopted those things, when you first attached to them, they may have been perfectly fine. They served you well then. Don't feel antagonistic toward them. Just realize they don't serve you now. They no longer help you. So write them all down, all of the things that you may have believed but are no longer serving you, and burn them and send them away. And you might want to do a little incantation as you do that, affirming what you're doing. You want to send energy into it. You want to put as much energy into it as possible. But just the act of burning it is a very powerful thing. I think, and I imagine everyone present has already done this for something or another. You already know how transformative it is. But for something that on one hand seems so simple, it's very profound. And the more that you put into it, the more profound it's going to be. And I found that everything was different the next day. I found the effect almost instantaneous within the extent that I was able to take it at that time. And that's an important part of shadow work because there will always be more. Even when you get to the root of it, one thing, there'll be another thing. But that's normal. It's part of being alive. We always must be examining ourselves. We always must be healing ourselves. It's what we're here to do. It's what we're about. I would almost go so far as to say it's one of the primary purposes of our physical existence, growth and healing. Um, Even if the healing is partly the effect of the growth. Um, so that is a simple technique for identifying and healing aspects of your shadow. I mentioned the healing bath from first degree, which is basically a similar technique using water. And it involves a self-blessing, but also identifying the things that hold you back, the things that cause you pain, the things that limit you, which is to say your shadow, and releasing them as part of that healing bath. Also a very important technique of shadow work. The truth of the matter is there are so many different ways of doing this. I could not begin to list all of them. And if you look at first degree, and really throughout the degrees, you'll find many of them. In chapter 8, we had one specifically for dealing with shadows related to body image. And that involved making a picture of yourself as you are and examining how you feel about that. Do you feel bad about how you are manifest in this physical world? And if so, why? And then working to heal any negative feelings. And to then make an image of your ideal self, not necessarily physically, but all the good things about yourself. And do a burning to emphasize and more greatly manifest those good things. That's an example of shadow work. Another example of shadow work that I don't think is in the degree lessons, but is something that I've done with people, is to make an image of yourself for your altar, your highest self, your best self, the self you want to be, and work with it as if it were a spirit guide. Work with building yourself in that way. That is a kind of shadow work. There are so many different things if you think about it. Divination is very often shadow work. When you do things like astrology or numerology for the purpose of character analysis, that's shadow work in a way. You're looking at yourself. You're looking for the good things, you're looking for the bad things. and you're working to get the best way to emphasize the good. These are different kinds of shadow work. They're all different kinds of shadow work. And again, there are so many things you can use for shadow work that I could not begin to list all of them. But we have talked in great detail about them throughout the degree lessons. And again, we often don't call it that. So if you go back to your degree books and you look chapter by chapter and ask yourself, was this shadow work? You're going to find in a lot of cases that that spell of the month was shadow work, but not called that. Because when you were a brand new first degree, that might have frightened you. It might have caused you to say, I can't do that. That's scary. Or it might have interacted with your shadow to say, I can't do that. That's bigger than I am. That's too much for me to be able to do at this level. That's why we didn't use those terms. I can remember 20 odd years ago, a criticism being levied against our degree materials that didn't include any shadow work, which all I can say is the person obviously didn't know what shadow work was, or they'd have recognized it without the term being used. When we talk about the dark night of the soul, which is not a term I use a lot, but you find it, for example, in discussions of the hero's quest and so forth. The point where you have to face yourself, that's shadow work. That is a poetic description of shadow work. But it very often happens to us in life that we go through this period of great emotional turmoil that forces us to look at those things that hold us back and to heal it in one way or another. But when we're doing it consciously, when we're doing it through these many techniques, we don't necessarily have to go through it that way. Everyone, whether they're on a metaphysical path or not, is going to end up doing shadow work. It's part of why we're here. Some of them will do it successfully. A lot of them will not. I've known people who went through their whole lives dominated by their shadow. And I'll tell you, when you work with people psychically, if you work as a psychic in particular, you meet lots of different people, you'll find that there are people who have far more shadow than not. People who have so much of their energy wrapped up in that shadow, they barely have energy for this life at all. And some of them will deal with it in this life, some of them will wait for another. And that's on them. That's their choice, and it may not be time for them to do it now. But if you watch for it, you'll notice it. Other people have very little because they have been working on it. It is possible to go through life with very little shadow, but not possible, in my opinion, to go through life with none. Because there are always going to be things that will affect you in ways that you may not be conscious of. And so you must always be open to shadow work, no matter how long you're doing this, no matter how skilled you think you are, there will always be more. You know, one of the best pieces of advice I ever received, and it's in the degree materials, farther along than some of you have gotten, but I'll go ahead and tell you anyway. When I had my third degree initiation, the advice I received from Lady Crystal, which is still the best advice I think I've ever received, was not to look at this as an ending of my period of learning and training, but rather as the beginning that I had achieved, for one better way to put it, the basics, but there was far more to learn and do. And there would never be a time that one should stop learning. All of life is about learning. All of life is meant to be continued expansion, continued growth. And when you come to the point that you're not growing, you're really not living. And, you know, if you look around the world, you'll see plenty of people who are only barely living because they've decided to stop growing. And that's unfortunate. However, there again, you never know what's going on in another person's life, and maybe they're growing in ways you are not seeing. You have to bear that in mind as well. But my attitude is that we must always be opening new doors, always learning new things. But as we do that, naturally, some of them are going to end up in our shadow, so we must also always be doing shadow work. Now, at this point, we are at the half hour, and I want to segue into the most effective tool for shadow work, in my opinion, and that's soul retrieval. And we're going to talk about that for a few minutes. And the soul retrieval is the same idea that much of your energy is alienated from you. And depending on who's speaking, they will depict it in various ways. I will say it's in your shadow. It's cut off from your main being. And one way of reintegrating and healing that is by, quote, retrieving it, end quote. This is a term that comes out of shamanism. It basically is a shamanic technique. There are a variety of ways of doing it. The more or less traditional shamanic way of doing it is through a trip to the afterlife or to the other world, which some will view as the afterlife. Some might view it in different ways. Shamanism has many different paths within it. And looking for your lost energy there, usually with the help of animal spirit helpers in many forms of shamanism. Correllian practice of soul retrieval works a little differently, but it's the same idea. Going into the other world, meeting with the divine forces, however you perceive them, and receiving back your alienated energy. And how do we do this? Well, the first thing that we do, and I think that most everyone in this room has had some experience of this, but first you want to go into a trance state and go into the other world. We often portray this as being surrounded by a ball of light and carried between the worlds into the presence of deity. And you want to allow deity to appear to you in any way that deity chooses to appear to you. It might be the way you commonly interact with deity. It may not. For me, it's usually just light that I see when I do soul retrieval, sometimes in an anthropomorphic form, not always. Sometimes it will resemble a particular deity, such as Sekhmet, or even Anubis, but not always by any means. But other people will perceive that energy in different ways. I think the most interesting one, I had a person I worked with who perceived deity in this context as a tree on a hill. Beautiful tree, might say the world tree. And when they did their soul retrievals, little, as they put it, squirrel rats would come out of the tree to help them. And these were the divine helpers who were assisting. And I've always thought that was a beautiful and unique way of seeing it, but everyone will have a unique way of seeing it. And it may not be the same every time. And this is important because every time you do this is not the same. And what is needed may differ. The way you perceive it may differ. So when you're there attempting to perceive deity, you want to allow deity to be whatever it needs to be for you at that moment. Might not be what you expect. And this is true in many cases, but especially here. Having perceived deity, you want to identify to deity. You want to be polite and give greeting to deity, explain why you're there. And you're there to ask for healing. You want to identify to deity what that healing is. And you may not know. And you might want to say, for example, deity, I'm asking for healing for whatever is holding me back, whatever is afflicting me, whatever is causing this particular emotion that you're feeling, or whatever is blocking a particular situation. You don't really need to know what it is. This is very important. But if you do know what it is, you can be more specific. If you have done self-examination and you realize that the thing that's holding you back from getting the ideal job you've always wanted is that your parents told you could never do that when you were a child, well, that's the thing you need to heal. You can be very specific with that. And it's also often good to say, and anything else that's contributing to this problem. Sometimes you may be dealing with past life situations. and you'll want to identify those. The more specific you can be, in my opinion, the better it is, but you also want to keep that door open to what you don't see, because very often you won't see everything. You can do this for a large number of items all at once. And you can also do it for just whatever the immediate need is. Um, but either way, you want to identify that to deity, and then there are several steps that you will go through with deity. The first is the healing. And I always say that you ask deity to help you to heal that which you have identified and to send down the golden light of healing upon you. And I perceive this as a golden light that comes down and bathes you in that golden light and moves through you. And how quickly that light moves through you as you're visualizing it um, really is how long the healing is taking. Sometimes it will go quickly, sometimes it goes slowly. Sometimes I find it necessary to say, um, to continue affirming that the light is healing everything it touches, that it's moving through me, etc. Sometimes I can feel it get caught in certain places, and I may need to work specifically with that place, but the light will eventually move all the way through you and then out of you. Then you know the healing has occurred. You then want to ask deity to help you with the acceptance of that healing, because it is entirely possible to get a healing and not accept it. You want to, I describe that as a feeling of warmth moving through you in the same way that the golden light moves through you. It comes through the crown, moves down through the feet. And that too can sometimes take longer than others, depending on how hard you're having, how hard a time you're having in accepting that healing. Sometimes it will get caught in certain places, and you may have to apply a little extra pressure there, or even remove a blockage in the manner of energetic healing. But it will move through you. And then you want to integrate that energy. And I usually describe that as imagining the energy like liquid flowing down a drain. And I imagine it all flowing into the heart and draining into the heart. And I've found that the easier it is to integrate the healing that has been accomplished, the more fluid that energy is going to feel. And if you're having trouble integrating it, it will feel like a heavy syrup. But you want to continue working with that as long as it takes to integrate it all into your heart. So if you've been with me when I have presided over this particular technique, you will see that sometimes these different steps take longer than others. This is why. If you're doing this for another person, you will feel what's happening just as they should be feeling it. This is how you know when it's time to move forward. You will feel when the healing, when the acceptance, when the integration have finished, so that you know to move forward. Without having to ask them, are you ready? You will know because you're having the same sensation. That also makes this a very good technique to use with other people, because it means that you're repeating it for yourself as well. Even if you're not necessarily aiming it for yourself, it will still have positive effects for you. Having done that, you then want to hand over all the burdens that you have carried from what has been healed, accepted, and integrated. And when I started, I visualized these as boxes, parcels, things you might send in the post. Later, sometimes as twigs or sticks or logs. But you hand them over to spirit. You take them from yourself and you give them to spirit. Later, I started to perceive it kind of like the room of requirement in Harry Potter. All kinds of different stuff piled together. And often, the things that I would see as I was handing over these burdens to spirit would tell me something about the burdens I'd been carrying, because they might be anything. And I kind of recommend that as a way of viewing this. And you want to hand them over and ask spirit to take them. And I usually see that as the purple light of transmutation, suffusing them and causing them to disappear and go away. And sometimes you may want to ask, for that purple light to come directly into you and take what you have not seen, because often you won't see everything. And I have found that sometimes that's like being consumed by a purple flame. It can be extremely intense, depending how much is there to be released. And you want to keep doing this until you have released all the burdens you have carried. Um, that can be a little time or it can be a lot of time. And then you have to do the hardest part of this whole exercise, and that is forgiveness. Forgiveness can also be described as releasing, because a lot of people, especially in the pagan world, have an issue with the term forgiveness because they don't understand what it means. They think it means releasing someone else from the consequences of their behavior. And in a legal sense, maybe it might mean that. But in a metaphysical sense, no, it has nothing to do with the other person. It has to do with releasing your connection to that other person, letting them go so that you can go without carrying them on your shoulders. We often don't realize that we're carrying them on our shoulders, but we are. So every person who's contributed to this situation that you have healed and released, you want to forgive and release them. Every situation that was part of it, you want to forgive it and release it. Everything whatsoever that had anything to do with it, you want to forgive it and you want to release it. And this is hard sometimes, because sometimes we really want to hold on to it. We don't want to let go of it. But you're not really going to be free of it if you don't let go of it. And the point of this is to be free of it. So you want to forgive as deeply and completely as you can. You also want to forgive yourself, because chances are high that you're blaming yourself for part of what you've had to heal and release. Sometimes you're blaming yourself for everything. People have a tendency to do that. So make sure in this process that you forgive yourself as much as anyone else. And finally, make sure that you forgive deity, however you perceive deity, or deities, or however you perceive it. Forgive deity also, because often we're blaming deity for these things, not necessarily consciously. But it's how could God let this happen, when it really had nothing to do with God or deity. So make sure that you also forgive there. And then you're ready for the most important part of this, if not the most difficult. This part is easy by comparison. You want to ask for the lost parts of yourself back. All of the energy that's been alienated from you in your shadow, that has been at a distance where you could not see it, now you take it back into yourself. And I usually perceive that as little bits of light coming back into my aura, going back to where they originally came from. Sometimes there's a lot, sometimes there's a little. It depends what it was. For me, this is the best way to see it. And it's usually brightly colored light, almost like a stained glass window or the parts thereof. And you want to see these coming back and taking up their proper place within your energetic being. And then you go through those first 3 steps again. You ask for the golden light of healing to heal those lost parts of yourself, so that they are healed in their proper positions. You want to ask for the help with acceptance, to feel that warm energy wash through you, so that you've accepted the healing of the lost parts of yourself and you want to integrate them. Feel that energy washing into your heart, to the center of your being. And when you've done that, you've completed the soul retrieval. You want to thank deity for that, and you may ask if deity has anything else to tell you. And depending on your particular skills and background, you may get a message in words. You may get a message in pictures. You may get the image of an object, or you may just get a knowing. And sometimes you won't get anything at that moment, but it will come to you later. And with that, you thank deity and you get back in your bubble of light and return to the everyday here and now. I have found that to be the most effective form of shadow work I've ever encountered, probably the most effective form of magic I've ever encountered. I cannot recommend it too strongly. anytime something seems to be holding you back or causing you pain, or anytime you can't find the answer to something and need to remove whatever is blocking your quest for that answer, this is a wonderful technique to use. And again, I can't recommend it highly enough. However, if you're just starting your spiritual journey, you may want to work up through it through these other simpler forms of shadow work. And I talked about burning, I talked about the healing bath, I talked about the spell from lesson 8. There are numerous of them in the degree lessons. All of them work to move you toward healing your shadow. The soul retrieval works faster, but you have to have a certain skill in visualization to be able to do it. So we also have these other simple techniques. The burning in lesson 2, I believe, can be a form of shadow work, as I described with the technique that Lady Crystal first gave me. These are all things, well, wasn't the first technique of shadow work she gave me, but again, the way that we have historically taught, we work up to using that term because the term can be a blocker or a stopper, however you want to phrase it, because people get frightened of terms like shadow. So you want to introduce people to things gently. And if you look at everything I do, all the books I've written, I've tried to follow that policy. All of the teaching I've done, I've tried to follow that policy to introduce ideas gently to meet people where they are. I've often said that one of my mother's favorite sayings was meet people where you find them. That you cannot help a person by handing them something that's beyond their ability. You have to see where their ability is and give them what they can do. And I cannot emphasize too strongly the importance of that. I think most people here are on a clergy path, or maybe on a clergy path later if they're not already, where they'll be working with other people. And, this is important. And it also sometimes brings you into those shadow things because you may find as you deal with other people that you have judgments that are rooted in things in your shadow that you may need to work with because they're stopping you from reaching people where they are. But, in the end, is this really the example I want to give? I guess it is. Thank you, Spirit. Because I'm going to assume this came from Spirit. You cannot give someone a spell in Latin who does not speak Latin and think they're going to be able to make much of it. Although for some people, not being able to understand the words is also helpful because they imagine it to be stronger than it is. But as an example, you have to work with the skills people have. But as you develop that technique of soul retrieval, I think you'll probably agree with me that it is astoundingly effective. And with that, I think that I have talked at great length about what the shadow is and how to work with the shadow. And so I think my last comments will be why we work with the shadow. And it should be obvious that part of it is to eliminate the things that block us, that hold us back, that limit us. And again, you're never going to be without one. No matter how advanced you become, there will always be certain things in your shadow, and you just keep working with it. However, at a certain point, you will find that you have dealt with most of the things, but new things will always be coming. You'll also find, and this is important to say, you do really deep shadow work, you'll find things that you did not think were in you, but thought were in the world at large. And there's a certain level because of the idea of as above, so below, the idea that in the end, there's one energy going through everything. Once you've dealt with all the things that are truly personal to you, you will also find there's a level of universal shadow. And working with that will help everyone. The more that you work with, shall we say, the evils of the world, in healing those within yourself, you'll find that it also works in the outside world, at least as you're experiencing it. So, with that, I think that I've exhausted the subject. I hope you found it interesting. I'm going to go ahead and say um, thank you for being here. I hope that it was helpful to you. I'm going to turn off the recording, and then those of us who are physically here will have a little time to chat.